Hello, and welcome back to our series of quick, concise country histories. Today, we are tackling an absolute giant, a nation that has shaped world events for centuries. So let's dive into the epic, sprawling story of Russia. I mean, seriously, how does a nation even get that big? It's a huge question, and the answer is this incredible saga of conquest, revolution, and unbelievable resilience. We're going to go from Viking warriors all the way to spacefaring cosmonauts to tell the story of how Russia became Russia. All right, let's get into it. When you think of Russia's origins, you probably think of Moscow, right? Well, that's actually not where our story begins. Nope, we have to go way back into the forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe, where scattered Slavic tribes were about to be brought together by some newcomers from the north. This is the very beginning. Okay, so what you're looking at here are three kind of like foundational moments that basically set the entire course for Russia's future. First up, you've got these Scandinavian Vikings, the Varangians, who show up and bring some political order to the chaos. Then, and this is huge, Prince Vladimir adopts Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. That one decision, it shapes Russian culture for the next 1,000 years. And then, bam, the Mongol invasion. It just completely wrecks that first state, but, and this is the key part, it paves the way for a brand new power to rise from the ashes. So, for more than 200 years, the Russian princes are basically paying tribute to the Mongol Golden Horde. But the princes in this pretty minor town called Moscow, well, they were smart. They played the long game. The Mongols gave them the job of collecting tribute from other princes, and they used that authority to quietly build up their own power. And then in 1480, Ivan the Great finally stands up and says, "Enough is enough," effectively ending Mongol dominance. Now, here's a really important side effect. All this time under Mongol rule kind of isolated Russia from Western Europe, which means they pretty much missed out on huge things like the Renaissance. Okay, so the Mongols are out of the picture. What happens next? Well, the rulers in Moscow start seeing themselves in a completely new light. They're not just princes anymore. Oh no, they see themselves as the absolute sovereigns of a massive, growing land. And this next era, it's going to be all about powerful rulers grabbing more land and a really dramatic and complicated turn towards the West. To really get this period, you have to understand this one word: autocracy. This isn't just about being a king. It's the belief that the czar has almost divine, totally unquestionable authority. And the guy who really set the mold for this was Ivan IV. You probably know him as Ivan the Terrible. He was the first to officially crown himself czar, and boy, did he use that power to ruthlessly crush anyone who even looked at him funny. After a period of pure chaos, they literally called it the Time of Troubles, the Romanov dynasty takes power. And get this, they would rule for over 300 years. Just think about that. And this timeline shows you some of the heavy hitters. You've got Peter the Great, who literally builds a new Western-style capital from nothing and declares an empire. Then there's Catherine the Great, who massively expands that empire. And then you have Alexander II, who takes the absolutely monumental step of freeing 23 million serfs. And this right here just perfectly illustrates the radical change under Peter the Great. I mean, he wasn't just reforming, he was trying to re-engineer Russia's whole identity. Old Moscow was the heart of ancient Slavic Orthodox tradition. St. Petersburg was his forced march into the modern world, a city built on a swamp specifically to face Europe with a whole new social structure based on merit, not just who your parents were. But for all its power, for all its expansion, the Tsarist Empire was really resting on a pretty fragile foundation. By the time we get to the early 20th century, the pressures of war, poverty, and political anger are building and building, about to cause an explosion that would change the world forever. The fuse? It was about to be lit by a catastrophic new kind of industrial war. Wow. Just look at that number. Over 2 million Russian soldiers killed in World War I. And that's not even counting the millions more who were wounded or captured. The strain of the war on Russia was just catastrophic. The army was badly equipped, the leadership was awful, and back home people were starving and society was collapsing. This wasn't just a military crisis, it was a moment that made the entire Tsarist system lose all legitimacy in the eyes of its people. It was really a perfect storm. You have total disaster on the battlefield, people starving in the cities, a political system that refuses to change, and a royal family that seemed completely out of touch, with shady characters like Rasputin just adding fuel to the fire. The entire structure was just ready to fall over. And collapse it did. in two main stages. The February Revolution was this spontaneous popular uprising that just toppled the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, gone. But the new liberal government that took its place just couldn't solve the country's massive problems. And that created a huge opening for Vladimir Lenin and his radical Bolsheviks, who, in October, launched a disciplined coup and seized power for themselves. Now, the Bolsheviks were communists, and their goal was completely radical. They weren't just changing the government. They were trying to engineer a totally new kind of society based on the ideas of Karl Marx. This ideology, abolishing private property, aiming for a classless state, would become the single guiding force for Russia's path for the next 70 years. So after Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin takes control and launches one of the most brutal social experiments in history. On one hand, he industrialized the Soviet Union at a breathtaking pace with his 5-year plans. But at the same time, he forced millions of peasants onto collective farms, seizing their grain and their land. The result? A modern industrial power, yes, but one built on a foundation of man-made famine and terror that killed millions. This quote, which is often attributed to Stalin, just captures the chilling reality of his rule. And the terror wasn't just limited to the countryside. During the Great Purge in the late 1930s, his regime systematically executed hundreds of thousands of people, from old rivals and army officers to just ordinary citizens. He created a society that was paralyzed by fear. And yet, somehow, out of all this terror and turmoil, the Soviet Union would emerge from the flames of World War II as one of only two global superpowers, locked in a decades-long struggle for the future of the planet. The scale of what the Soviet Union went through in World War II it's almost impossible to imagine. 27 million dead, soldiers and civilians. The country was devastated. But its victory over Nazi Germany, especially that moment the Red Army raised its flag over Berlin, became a source of immense national pride and a core part of the Soviet identity. It gave them huge prestige and, in their view, justified their control over all of Eastern Europe. And this is what set the stage for the Cold War. The world was basically divided into two camps, led by two superpowers, with completely opposite ideologies. For nearly 50 years, this conflict played out. Not in a direct war, thank goodness, but through a terrifying nuclear arms race, proxy wars from Vietnam to Afghanistan, and this huge ideological battle for the hearts and minds of the world. The end, when it finally came, was just shockingly fast. In the mid-'80s, the new leader Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the system with policies of openness and restructuring. But instead of fixing things, his reforms kind of just opened the floodgates and exposed how deeply flawed the system was. The economy couldn't be saved. Nationalist movements flared up, and in 1989, their allies in Eastern Europe just broke away. After a failed coup by communist hardliners in 91, the whole structure just came crashing down. So picture this. Christmas Day, 1991. The Soviet flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the very last time, and the new Russian Federation is born. But that transition from communism, well, it would prove to be chaotic, painful, and it would define everything that was to come. The 1990s were a deeply traumatic decade for Russia. The president, Boris Yeltsin, went with these radical economic reforms called shock therapy. The goal was basically to create a market economy overnight. But the immediate result? Total chaos. People's life savings were wiped out by hyperinflation, and a really messy privatization plan allowed a few well-connected people to buy up huge state industries for pennies, creating a new class of super wealthy oligarchs while most people's standard of living just collapsed. And out of the chaos of the 90s came this huge demand for order and stability, and that demand was met by Vladimir Putin. Since the year 2000, he has completely dominated Russian politics, and he's framed his entire era as a direct response to that previous decade. He re-centralized state power, used soaring oil and gas prices to fuel an economic recovery, and began aggressively reasserting Russia's influence on the world stage, an arc that eventually led to the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that brings us right up to today. When you look back at this whole 1,000-year history, you start to see these powerful themes that just keep coming back, don't you? A tendency towards strong, centralized rule, a relentless drive for territorial security and expansion, and this incredible capacity to endure immense hardship. So the big question is, how will these deep historical patterns continue to shape Russia's path in the 21st century? And that's our quick history of Russia. It is a vast, complex story, and believe me, we've only scratched the surface. If you enjoyed this, please check out the other explainers in our playlist and be sure to subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.